Coming up on the programme.
My Lords, they have voted contents 245, not contents 208, so the contents have it.
More defeats for the government's Rwanda bill, but is it time the House of Lords let the legislation pass? Thousands of unpaid carers face huge bills for benefit overpayments. Is it the government's fault or theirs?
Most carers are already in a poverty group, and this would make matters a lot worse.
Can foreign ministers meeting today calm tensions between Israel and Iran?
Any response should be smart and that should be designed in a way that is going to limit and try to de-escalate this conflict.
And new post-Brexit charges for some British imports. Will it mean higher prices in the shops? Joining me to discuss all that, Conservative peer Stuart Jackson, Labour MP and frontbencher Sir Chris Bryant, journalist and author Matthew Saeed, and lecturer at King's College London, Dalia Gabriel. This is Politics Live. Let's start with the government's Rwanda bill. Show you this headline in the Daily Express. They say Lords defy will of the people over Rwanda bill again. Yes, it was another round of parliamentary ping-pong, is the jargon, after the House of Lords delivered an unexpected double defeat to the government again yesterday. Now, one of the amendments passed by the Lords calls for exemptions to the small boats policy for people who have helped Britain's armed forces, such as Afghan interpreters. You voted against this, Stuart. Why?
Because I don't think at the moment it's clear that this wouldn't be subject to judicial activism and intervention, which has been, in many respects, the strategy of the opposition benches in the Lords to bog this whole bill down, not to scrutinise it and oversee and improve it, but basically to bog it down in a legal quagmire so it's inoperable. And that was my worry. Having said that, I do think there is a moral case, of course, for looking after the people that gave great service at great risk to us in the war in Afghanistan. And I do think if there can be some kind of compromise coming forward on Monday and Tuesday next week, I would be prepared. And I think the government and certainly ministers in the Lords would be willing to look at that, and so that there was some cross-party consensus on that.
I mean, why are Labour peers and others in the House of Lords delaying this, as the Home Secretary James Cleverly has said? He calls it a politically cynical effort to just stall something that is going to be on the statute, but probably by next week.
Well, I'm opposed to the whole bill. I think it's the policy is, as he himself used to say before he became Home Secretary, batshit crazy. It won't work. It simply won't work. It's cost £500 million already, and we haven't sent a single person to Rwanda. It makes the government the determinant, the sole determinant of whether Rwanda is or is not safe, regardless of whether or not it is, in actual fact, safe.
But do you agree that the House of Lords is just delaying this, the Lords who voted against it?
They're disagreeing with the government. And I mean, we just had a terrible piece of casuistry from the Tory peer here, saying, oh, yes, of course I'm in favour of doing everything we can for the people who very, very bravely assisted British troops in Afghanistan. And let's not forget that when we left Afghanistan, there was a terrible mess. Tens of thousands of people who'd worked with us who are in profound danger didn't have a means of coming out with us. So they have had to find whatever route they can back to safety. It seems preposterous that you shouldn't be accepting that amendment at least.
Well, Stuart, answer that before I bring the others in.
Well, obviously, Chris's friend, President Biden, was responsible for the disaster of that withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Well, it was Obama.
Well, hang on. Let's concentrate on the bill here, though, and the actions of the Lords.
What we see here, the bigger strategic picture, is that the people have decided they voted for a government with a mandate to stop the boats and deal with illegal migration, and the Labour Party have voted over 100 times against it, in the absence of any demonstrably plausible alternative from the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats. That's the only game in town. So stop playing political games, I would say to the Labour Party. Honour the people's will, which is to tackle this endemic issue, which is endemic across Europe, and actually pass the bill.
All right. Honour the people's will, or it's a mad plan, to paraphrase Chris Bryant. Where are you?
Well, I think it's worth taking a step back away from the party politics and to recognise that this is not a problem that uniquely affects the UK. It's a problem for the Western world. And in a certain sense, a symptom of our success. Refugees fleeing persecution wish to come to Western liberal democracies. They don't want to go to China, Russia and North Korea, which are net exporters of refugees. But this means by implication that global instability is asymmetric. When there is additional instability, they come here. That gives China and Russia an incentive to stoke instability in Africa. The Wagner Group, they've got 5,000 people in there who are doing it in the Central African Republic, in Libya, Sudan and beyond. And at the moment, the Refugee Convention and the Human Rights Act is not fit for purpose because it provides the incentive, it is increasing the flow of refugees, and it is for the West as a whole to amend these treaties.
Amend how, though? I mean, is it an impossible situation? Can you ever stop these flows of people, and should you try?
The way to do it is to excise from the Refugee Convention the principle, forgive the pronunciation, of non-refoulement. Because if people knew, what that means is we're not allowed legally to export people to places where they might get persecuted. It is that gives the incentive to come here, because if they know they won't get deported, they will keep coming. If they know where they will get deported, they won't pay the people smugglers to come. It will eliminate the people smugglers' business model. We won't ever have to deport people because they won't come here in the first place. It will pull the rug from under President Xi and Putin, who have said that refugee flows are the Achilles heel of the West. And it means we can take more people. I would like us to take more refugees through safe and legal routes without them having to run the gauntlet of the... This is not just a win-win. It is an obvious thing we should do, but it requires politicians who can think systemically about how to protect and enlarge human rights.
Dahlia, where are you? You probably agree on the last point in person, safe routes.
Yes, I want to push back a little bit on this idea that all refugees come to the West. In fact, the vast majority of refugees are displaced to neighbouring countries. Lebanon, Turkey, other parts of North Africa have overwhelmingly taken the vast majority of refugees from parts of the world that are unstable. I also think it's quite strange to completely extricate the role of the US and Britain and Europe more generally in creating the conditions of mass displacement as some of the most powerful political and economic blocs in the world. For me, though, this Rwanda policy has always been just a piece of political theatre so that Rishi Sunak can squeeze one good headline out, a good headline according to him, to try and resuscitate his flailing political career. But we know that this deterrence model doesn't work.
How do we know, Dahlia, if it hasn't actually been put in place?
The senior civil. Firstly, we have mountains of evidence from historic immigration and refugee bills. But the most senior civil servant in the Home Office under Priti Patel wrote a letter to her saying, "I cannot back this policy because the deterrence policy does not have enough evidence to back that it actually stopping small."
A brief response, because we must move on.
All I would say is that the reason that neighbouring countries often take the brunt of refugee flows is because the West, at the moment, pays transit countries. Our foreign policy, which is often about aid, is actually sold and packaged as aid or strategy when we're actually asking these often dictators to stop the flows. We have created an obstacle course. It is rank hypocrisy, what we have done. And this is not... I voted Labour at most of my life, but Tony Blair gave weapons to Gaddafi as a quid pro quo for stopping the flow of refugees when he was Prime Minister, and he used these lethal weapons to kill people.
Well,
we are going to talk about...
in Libya didn't make it any better afterwards.
That's also true.
Let's leave it there. We're going to come back to Westminster politics because the Conservative MP Mark Menzies has been suspended from the Parliamentary Party following claims in The Times that he misused party funds. He strongly disputes the claims and said he had fully complied with all the rules for declarations. Let's talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman. Henry, what's happened here?
Well, these are still just allegations, Joe, but they are pretty serious allegations, and I have to say pretty peculiar allegations too. What The Times is reporting is that in December last year, Mark Menzies, who's been the Conservative MP for Fylde in Lancashire since 2010, rang up his 78-year-old former campaign manager in the middle of the night, 3:15 in the morning, and said what he called bad people had locked him in a flat, and he told her that he needed £5,000 as a matter of what he called life and death to get out. Now, it's claimed in this article that Mark Menzies' office manager, that's a different woman, then later in that day paid him the money from her personal bank account and, crucially, was subsequently reimbursed using campaign funds. Now, we at BBC News have contacted Mr Menzies for comment. We haven't been able to get a response from him yet. But in a statement that he provided to The Times, he said he strongly disputed the allegations and that he had fully complied with all the rules for declarations.
Henry, I understand that the Conservative Party knew about this situation or allegations in January. Why has it taken so long to get to this stage of him being suspended?
That's going to be one of the key questions, I think, on this story going forwards. Grant Shapps, who's the Defence Secretary, was out giving interviews this morning, and he acknowledged that the Conservative Party had known about at least some of the claims about Mr Menzies beforehand. I think he used the phrase for a while. He said that new information had since come to light that had led to his suspension. It's not clear if that just means the Times' story being published. But I think that is one of the questions. It's certainly one of the questions that the Labour Party is asking. Annalisa Dodds, who's the chairwoman of the Labour Party, has written to her Conservative counterpart, the Conservative chairman, Richard Holden, just in the last few moments, and asked whether, when the Conservative Party became aware of at least some of these allegations, whether they passed any of them to the police. That is where I think some of the political argument over this is going to progress.
Henry Zethman, thank you very much. Just broadly, I'm not talking about any of the specific individuals, Stuart, or allegations, but there are a number of MPs, yes, from across the political spectrum, but Conservative MPs too, former Conservative MPs who are now sitting as independents. What is going on here? There's all sorts of sort of allegations about inappropriate behaviour for a number of them. What is happening in the Conservative Party in selections?
A very good question. I don't know is the answer. I mean, I was in Parliament for 12 years. We had, well, in the Commons for 12 years, we did have cases on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, of these personal problems that members of Parliament encounter because of the unique nature of their job, you know, and being away from home and substance misuse, that kind of thing. And I think it's more endemic in that atmosphere in the Commons, not so much in the Lords, I've got to be honest. I know Mark Menzies. I think he's obviously in a bad place now. He's voluntarily relinquished the whip. I hope he gets all the help possible. It's not a party political issue, and actually I deprecate the fact that Annalisa Dodds has written already over this. It's not something to make party political capital. There are people on the Labour side that will accuse of very serious things. I think most people rally round in the Westminster Village and actually try and support someone that's going through a difficult time. So I think that's the answer, and I hope that Mark does get the help and others that are in a tricky situation as well. Let's
talk about carers, because...
Well, hang on. This is the worst Parliament in our history. 24 MPs have been... In
terms of the numbers, you mean?
24 MPs have been suspended for a day or more, or have left Parliament before a report into their misconduct has been published. And on top of that, 18 MPs now don't have the whip. The majority are Conservatives, as it happens. But some of those are people who are accused or have already been found guilty of sexual harassment, bullying, rape and domestic violence. This is a terrible Parliament. And one of the things that really upsets me is that Penny Mordaunt, who is the Leader of the House, has had on her desk now for more than 6 months a very simple proposal to deal with precautionary exclusion, risk-based exclusion of MPs who are accused of a sexual or a violent crime, which is exactly what you would have in any other line of work in the country, and she has refused to bring it to the House of Commons. I think this further brings the House of Commons into disrepute. All the polling over the last 70 years shows that this Parliament is the most distrusted, the Parliament with the worst reputation.
Sorry, Chris.
And that's why
Chris,
I think it's really, really important.
Physician, heal thyself. I mean, you lied about 2 separate individuals in Parliament, and under threat of legal action, you had to apologise. You lied about Nigel Farage, and you lied about Christopher
You were appointed
Chandler,
to the House of Lords by Boris Johnson.
You lied and you refused to apologise.
Stuart and Chris, we're not going to have mudslinging here in terms of party politics.
Other people.
It's an important point that you made about... Hang on. It's an important point that you made about Penny Mordaunt and what should happen in these cases in terms of having access to the Palace of Westminster. We're going to leave it there. We're going to talk about unpaid carers. Let me just show you this headline in BBC News. Unpaid carers shocked at having to repay thousands. Now, this is the story that tens of thousands of carers, people who look after disabled, frail or ill relatives, having unwittingly fallen foul of Department of Work and Pensions rules, are being forced to pay back huge sums. Just to give you a little bit of the details so you understand the figures that we're talking about, unpaid carers are entitled to a carer's allowance of £81.90 a week, providing they care for someone for at least 35 hours a week. And they are also allowed to work but must not make more than £151 a week after tax and expenses. Bear with me. People who do make more than that weekly limit, even if it goes over by a penny, must pay back the entire week's allowance for the whole period in which they were in breach of the rules. Now, thousands of carers were not alerted early on by the Department of Work and Pensions until years later and have built up huge penalties. One of them is Elizabeth Moss, who joins us now from Kent and who looks after her disabled son. Elizabeth, what has happened to you?
Hi. I've got a disabled son, as you said. I claimed carer's allowance because I was told that I could. I was working 16 hours a week, but I didn't realise that it was means tested as such. 8 years later, they got in touch with me telling me that I wasn't entitled to it and I had £18,000 to pay back.
£18,000, and you didn't hear from the DWP until 8 years after you'd started to claim this allowance?
That's right, 8 years.
What was your reaction when you got that letter or notice?
It made me sick. It made me sick to my stomach. That's a huge amount to have to pay back, especially when you are looking after somebody who's disabled. Yeah, it wasn't good.
Right, can you pay it back?
I did volunteer to pay back £50 a month, but then I got inundated with letters saying you need to increase it. And then I became disabled myself, and they decided that they were going to take it straight out of my PIP every month. But they've upped it to nearly £200.
Elizabeth, would you say this was your mistake, even if it was accidental? It's your mistake rather than the DWP's, the Department of Work and Pensions?
Well, the way I see it, yes, it was my mistake in the beginning, but how did it take 8 years for them to find it?
Right. I mean, Elizabeth, there are, I think, 150,000 people in a similar situation to you. Stuart, Ian Duncan-Smith, Conservative MP, has said there must be a pause while this is investigated. What's your reaction about what should happen now?
I absolutely agree with him, Joe. I think the government has to show flexibility, compassion, and it needs to support these folk who are doing a fantastic job, particularly younger people that are looking after parents. And I think it's completely wrong that what is a prima facie mistake by the DWP in not advising people early is now rebounding on people who are trying to do their best. And I think one thing that Mel Stride, the Secretary of State, should do is put a pause and look at each individual case, reduce the monthly payments if necessary. And, you know, if you ask most people, they applaud the work that carers do. And I just think we need some flexibility and pragmatism in this case.
Do you think, though, in the end, that people like Elizabeth in this situation should have to pay back the money at all, or it should be limited? I think the head of the Carers Association said 6 weeks and then written off. 6 weeks of penalties and then written off.
I think that would be a good compromise, because actually if you look at, in a cost-benefit analysis of the contribution that carers make in reducing the burden on taxpayers, you know, there is a case to be made for this, and I think it's deeply unfair that these individuals who are doing such an important role in society for the family and community were disadvantaged, not through their own fault.
Chris, what do you think?
I hate to say this, but I, broadly speaking, agree with everything that Stuart
just
said. It is allowed occasionally in public. I mean, look, the truth is, I've got constituents of my own who the rules are pretty complicated. As when you were reading them out, you were going, and most carers are you know,
Busy.
they're running from pillar to post, and the last thing they really want to do is spend all their time trying to understand all these rules. I think it's incumbent on government to have rules that are readily comprehensible, and also incumbent on government, the DWP in this case, to go back to people and say on a regular basis and to make sure that that they're not overclaiming. Because actually,
Keir Starmer hasn't committed to writing off these overpayments if Labour were to win the election.
It's partly difficult because we don't know what the precise total amount of money is. But I think DWP could and should publish the whole report that they've done and publish it in full now so that we can all understand the full pattern of the problem that we've got.
What do you say to Elizabeth? I mean, listening to that story, I mean, Matthew, sympathy, understanding? I mean, rules are necessary when it comes to benefits, I suppose, but what's your reaction?
I think my reaction is, I think of the welfare state, which is a wonderful thing, but the greatest welfare state the world has ever known is the family, which does the vast majority, as I understand it, of the unpaid care in this country. I think of my cousin Andrew, who looked after Auntie Vera with dementia. My mum looked after her parents, and now a family member almost full time. You know, I come from a mixed race background. My father, Pakistani, passed away now. My mum from Wales. And I think in Western culture, I love Western culture, fantastic. But I think one thing we sometimes miss is the importance of family, particularly looking after elderly relatives and caring from them and being compassionate towards them. I don't think it's a nickel and dime issue. I think we just need a slight cultural shift. But broadly speaking, I think we should celebrate more our great paid carers. They do a tremendous
Isn't it a nickel and dime issue as well, though? Because what if you can't afford to do what you are saying? Families don't often live close by. People do have to work. That is why it is important in terms to get down to the nitty-gritty of money.
It is a factor. The fiscal dimension is important. But I think the bigger picture is we have strong, cohesive, extended families of whatever kind. That has a power that goes beyond any fiscal consideration.
Dahlia?
I mean, I think that sounds lovely, but it's wholly unrealistic when you consider the economics of the family. It's the economy that is tearing the family unit apart and is straining the family today. And making it incredibly difficult to build these kind of communal infrastructures. I mean, you talk about the amount. I don't think that that unpaid care workers should pay a single penny back to the state. Carers UK research found that unpaid carers, their work is valued at £445 million a day.
That's how they've got a metric for it.
That's the amount of money, of value that unpaid carers create. Our social care system is completely shambolic, and these unpaid carers are holding it together by the grit of their teeth, and the idea that because of a government failure, which, by the way, the numbers that they were outlining, £150 a week, £80 a week, how do you expect someone to live on that when they're looking after someone who is dependent on them? And now we're calling, rather than reimbursing them for the theft that we have done by the fact that they create so much economic value and get so much little in return, we're expecting them to owe us. It's absurd. It's a topsy-turvy world.
Elizabeth, if you were making a direct appeal, you've got two politicians here. What would you say to them?
Well, I agree it should be written off. I mean, it's made me ill. And I'm still caring for my disabled son, even as an adult now. He's never going to move out. So, you know, where do I get the money from to look after him? I'm still working.
Yeah, you make a very strong point, and I'm not sure whether we'll end up doing some kind of cap or what arrangement there will be. First of all, we need to get all the figures out there because you are not alone. You know, as we know, there are more than 100,000 people in a similar situation to yours. And what happens if you stop caring? The state has to pay. So, of course, it makes absolute sense for us to get to a situation where care works better. I'm very conscious. I represent a seat in the South Wales Valleys, the Rhondda, and many of our families do stick together much longer. But one of the economic pressures is there's not much employment locally. So then people move to somewhere in England or where there are jobs, and then it's much more difficult for them to do that caring job. And it's a depressing fact that my numbers might not be right, but I think it's something like 1 in 2 people over the age of 75 is living on their own. And so that's, again, you know, there are lots of people who aren't even getting the care that they need.
All right. Elizabeth Moss, thank you very much. We'll follow this story and obviously bring any developments or government response in terms of any overpayments being written off. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to return to the world stage, I say very grandly, by reading this headline. BBC News, if you've been following the programme Politics Live this week, you will be across what happened at the weekend in terms of the unprecedented attack by Iran on Israel, and there have been representations from other world leaders, including David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary. But this has been the response. They have asked for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, to sort of pull back. But Israel makes own decisions, Netanyahu says, after Cameron talks. I mean, Dahlia, you heard Lord Cameron there in the headline saying, OK, but any response should be smart. What does that mean, any response? Having said don't respond or retaliate and de-escalate, wasn't it inevitable that if a country is hit, all right, they defended themselves with their Iron Dome, but they had these missiles aimed at them, 300 or so, that they were going to respond?
Well, I mean, it's the issue, the fundamental contradiction here, which is that Britain has given a carte blanche, you know, militarily, financially, politically, to Israel, who is, as far as I'm concerned, recklessly threatening to escalate this even further. The reason that David Cameron does not want Israel to escalate this is because I think he is aware that Iran escalating in response further and this breaking out into a regional conflict, which Benjamin Netanyahu is very willing for this, is anticipating and wants this to take place in order to take eyes away from the atrocities being committed in Gaza right now. He knows that Iran, first of all, is very sophisticated. This is not a rinky-dink regime. This is very sophisticated militaristically. They are pretty resilient to economic sanctions. Every country that hosts a US or a British military base could be disrupted as a result. The energy supply lines will be compromised. I don't think that Cameron believes that the US and Israel and Britain could win in this regional escalation.
Although all the commentary is that Iran doesn't really want to escalate it either.
I don't think Iran... I mean, Iran has said that, as far as they are concerned, they were responding to an attack on their embassy. They released these missiles, which were sort of very much, you know, not the worst that they could do. Okay. And as far as they're concerned, the matter is closed. So my question is, given that we are on the brink of this escalating into a regional war that will have global impact, and Israel has shown itself to consider itself above every single law, including international law regarding the Genocide Convention, when is enough enough? At this point, we are accountable for Israel's response in a way that we're obviously not accountable for Iran's response.
That, of course, is a big difference. So, Matthew, what's your reaction to the attempts to try and de-escalate tensions, to use the word?
My analysis here is that the Hamas attack on October the 7th was incited and inspired by Iran, because the basic trajectory in that part of the world was a growing rapprochement between Israel and the Sunni world. The Abraham Accords, there was potential for a Saudi Arabian rapprochement as well, and this was much to the detriment of Iran's strategic interests. And the medieval barbarities that were perpetrated on October the 7th, in my view, were precision engineered to goad Israel into an overreaction, which I think that they have walked into the trap that was set for them. Understandably, don't get me wrong, I can fully see where they're going with this. But the other thing that I think, the other dimension that I think is being missed is the growing connective tissue, strategic, military and energy interests between Iran, China, Russia and North Korea. And the ground war in Europe, we are being distracted as a world from what's going on in the Middle East. I think this is much to Putin's advantage. We must take that into account as well.
Right. How?
Well, the thing we really need to do is the whole of the Western world, but particularly the NATO European countries, have to spend more on defence. We agree. Let's just set it out. In 2006, we tacitly agreed as NATO nations to spend 2% of GDP on defence. America, since the 1960s, has had a global fleet defending the shipping lanes that enables us to enjoy global trade, from which we have enjoyed huge benefits without making a fair share to the contribution. We have consistently violated this agreement. We look at Washington for not putting the 60 billion towards Ukraine.
The explanation to begin with, so you don't need to then create these defence mechanisms. Right now, Israel is found to be, by the highest court of the land,
No, it isn't.
is found to be plausibly committing genocide.
No, it's
and
not
we
at
know
all. It's not.
the
It's untrue for you to say that.
The ICJ
No, it doesn't.
said that there is
Hasn't.
a plausible risk of genocide,
Well,
which is the strongest.
that's not the same as a finding.
Because
I mean,
they
that
cannot
wording,
find
but
something
Dahlia,
in
but
this
that
timescale.
wording
It's
is the correct
strongest-
wording.
It is the
Can I-
strongest sanction that the ICJ can place
not
on
a
a
finding.
state within this time frame.
Can I just stick, though, to this idea of defence spending and whether or not, Matthew, you've got a lot of hindsight here because, well, I mean, perhaps, I mean, everybody, in the sense that we should be spending much more on defence because of the risks we are facing now. Let me put it to the politicians. You're nodding away. Perhaps we should be spending more on defence. What are you going to spend less on if we're going to spend a lot more on defence?
Well, I think we should spend more on defence.
but
I think
we're
we have to reduce spending in other areas, obviously, because we're in a very dangerous geopolitical situation. And I totally agree with Matthew's very astute analysis on this. Iran is the biggest product through the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps of terrorism, exporting terrorism throughout the Middle East and the world. And just to come back on this issue, it wasn't some bog standard consulate in Damascus. It was a meeting of people who were working with Hezbollah to attack Israel in Damascus. It was a legitimate target.
But do you agree that
for you to say,
attacking an
well,
embassy...
It's only 300 or 400
that is often
second-grade missiles.
Do you agree that attacking an embassy in a foreign land is considered widely to be a declaration of war?
Well, if IRCG combatants are there planning further terror
But
in
there
Lebanon
is
and
there
Israel.
is a special status. There is a special status afforded to embassies, and we also know that Israel is extremely reckless and indiscriminate with its destruction
Why
of, for
do you
example,
hold
civilian
Israel at
infrastructure.
a higher standard? Israel is a democracy.
Because
it's a civil
my
society.
taxes are funding Israel. My
1%
taxes are not funding
military
my
equipment.
taxes, and the country that represents me, the country that I am accountable to and who is accountable to me, is an ally of Israel.
Well, let Matthew, hang on, Matthew. Well, let Matthew come in and then I'll come to you, Chris. Yeah, I know. Well, we'll come back to that. Matthew, just respond and then I'll come to you, Chris.
I think it's remarkable that we're missing the big picture.
Yeah.
China has the biggest GDP in the world on a purchasing power parity basis. The energy interests of Europe are highly vulnerable because of the energy transition. China is committing genocide. It has a totalitarian surveillance state enabled by artificial intelligence. Russia is engaging in war crimes on the ground in Europe. Iran is whacking women who dare to lift the hijab.
Are those our allies?
These are not our allies. What I'm saying is...
We are responsible for the people that we support. We are responsible
let me just
for the
We're also responsible for... I said back in 2014, when we basically allowed Putin to take Crimea off Ukraine, thereby breaching his agreement under the Budapest Accords, that if we let him carry on like that, with impunity, he would come for the rest of Ukraine, and that would be a war on our doorsteps. And I don't think we still have taken that seriously enough. So, for instance, Russian oil is now being sent through a kind of hidden group of tankers. We've got lots of circumventing of sanctions by sending things through Kazakhstan and other neighbours. We still haven't had a single penny from the money from the sale of Abramovich's Chelsea go to Ukraine, and we still haven't seized Russian state assets which are sitting in British banks to be able to go towards the reconstruction of Ukraine. Absolutely right, Matthew, about how I think what is happening I think Putin is very happy for Iran and Israel to be facing each other off. Of course we want to de-escalate the row. We do not want a major further conflagration in the Middle East. Of course Israel doesn't have a blank check in what it does in Rafah, for instance. A major assault on Rafah would be completely inappropriate. It's been wrong that 33,000 people have already been killed.
Yeah, you can ask Dahlia a question, but before you do, I just want to come back to what affects people here, which Dahlia is talking about in terms of what taxpayers here should contribute if we want to up our defence spending. I mean, all of this is very pertinent, but it would require massive amounts of funding, and no one's told me what we're going to spend less on. Neither Labour nor the Conservatives are saying, yes, we're going to, the peace dividend's over. It's over. We're going to spend a lot less on health and welfare. We're going to put it all into defence. Is that what you're proposing?
So I don't think we can afford to do that latter bit, but we certainly do need to do a new defence strategic review. And it shouldn't just be, as previous defence reviews were, a matter of just cutting, which is what we did in the past. I'm not convinced that we now have armed forces in this country which are of sufficient number and sufficiently provided for. We also have a procurement system which has been bust for years and we need to sort out. But I don't think we have sufficient to be able to meet the challenges that are coming in the future years. It's not just about the UK. We have to do this with our allies. I would like us to sign a treaty with the EU around defence and security, which I know is what Theresa May asked for right at the beginning of the Brexit negotiation. It's one of the things we need to be sitting down with our allies because we need them to be spending more as well.
Right. Well, you raised your eyes at that point.
Because we led the way in preparing for what was going to happen in Ukraine in terms of procurement and giving aid and support to Ukraine. But I broadly agree with Chris. There were some difficult decisions to be made, and Matthew's absolutely right. And in fact, amazingly, he did support President Trump's position on NATO, I think, in the Sunday Times last week, that he's absolutely right. They've got to step up to the plate, particularly the Germans, who are the richest country in Europe.
Well, you wanted to ask Dahlia.
Well, I was going to say, the Americans have tried gentle diplomacy for decades. Kennedy was warning about European free riding on defence in 1963. It took Trump to actually get people to listen. And, by the way, after a ground war had happened in Europe that we are still not making a proper contribution to, Belgium, which hosts NATO, the spending of GDP on defence is 1.2%. A couple of years ago, it's 0.9%. They are lying through their teeth. Europe has to wake up. And the point that, if I may, wanted to ask Dahlia is, I was describing the atrocities of the autocratic access to try and get moral clarity that while Western liberal democracies are by no means perfect, we want them to win. This is why migrants from all over the world want to come to the West and not to China or to Russia. These are evil people. Yeah. And unless we are prepared to spend to deter and prevent war, we will go to World War III.
Dahlia?
It's highly likely if we don't spend on defence.
I think it's a very childlike view of the world to simply see things as good and evil. We need to look at the real political situation that is unfolding. And if we're going to talk about it from a place of moral superiority, which I believe we should be able to do, I believe that that is important in politics. We cannot claim that moral superiority when we are continuing to arm a state that has shown nothing but recklessness and nothing but disdain for the rulings of the highest international court in the. Do I live in Tehran or do I live in Britain?
We don't live in Israel either. You pontificate on Israel.
You can't claim moral superiority. You cannot claim moral superiority and then violate your own norms.
We're going to have to. Yeah, one tiny point, and then we must move on.
My tiny point is that one of the mistakes that was made when was it Bush did the Axis of Evil speech, which included Iran, was that led to us not being able to send an ambassador into Tehran. I think some people are calling for us to take our ambassador back from Tehran. I think that would be a terrible mistake. We need to keep on talking. I completely agree. Iran wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, but nonetheless, you still have to talk to bad people.
Right. We're going to sort of carry on the conversation in Brexit when it comes to our relationship with the EU. We're just going to take it down and talk about garden centres. No, this is the headline in The Guardian. Garden centres in UK stockpile plants before new Brexit checks. They're coming in on the 30th of April. You may remember that these have been delayed time and again. British growers and sellers fear government measures starting on the 30th of April could result in delays and plants being damaged. It's also about food imports. We can show you here. BBC News: Brexit food charges will eradicate my cheese shop. Important changes that are coming into place. Is this what people voted for, Stuart, people like you, when you voted to leave the EU?
I was honest that there would be some distortions as we left the single market. We're protecting our single market in the UK, the domestic single market. The same people that complain about bad food coming from Canada or Australia are the same ones complaining about this. We have to protect environmental regulations, health, farming, plant health. And the EU are doing the same. But the bigger picture, of course, is we've done deals with Mexico, Singapore, South Korea, Japan.
And are they making up for the deficit from leaving?
Well, they will do over a period of time.
Won't.
This is a projection, these figures. And actually, the inflation figures are a projection as to what the impact will be. I don't think given that only 8% of our food imports come from the European Union, and the wider point I would say is that 30 years ago, the European Union, by dollar denomination, was 30% of world trade. Within the next 15 years, it will be about 14%.
All right. Well,
so we're looking outwards. We're not looking.
Right. What are you saying to?
So number one, floristry is a £4.2 billion industry in this country, and they are really, really struggling at the moment. There are florists in every constituency in the land. I'm only looking at my phone because I forget the names of these flowers. No, I haven't got an appointment. Some flowers have been. I don't know why these particular flowers have been designated by the UK as medium risk, and therefore have to go through a special system, including orchidaceae, dianthus, gypsophila and solidago.
Good pronunciation. I'm glad I didn't have to read those.
Gypsophila. I might have got that wrong. But the point is that for businesses, because it's very time critical whether they get their flowers in and out, it's an additional £350 to £500 a day cost to them. Businesses are going to go bust. And then you can repeat all of this when it comes to medicines as well, because the supply chain through to the UK is meaning that people aren't able to get the medicines that they need. I mean, we should have frictionless trade, which is what we were promised by people like him when they lied to us about Brexit.
Oh, said very loudly and emphatically. Stuart, do you want to respond to that?
Well,
you lied.
Perhaps Chris wasn't listening at the outset of my remarks. I did say, I always said that when you're leaving a contracting single market to go out into the world to grow the economy, specialised manufacturing, creative services, etc., for the wide world out there, Chris, not just this fetish on the European Union, right? I never said there will be frictionless trade, because not least because the EU has a strategic objective to punish the UK for leaving the European Union.
These are our rules,
as Martin Selmayr said many years ago. So yeah, there will be some.
All right. Well, let me bring the others in. I mean, the charges range from £10 for low risk goods up to £145 for what they call mixed consignments. Costs that businesses will no doubt have to take on board, and we the consumers will have to pay up for. What do you think that's going to do? What impact will it have, briefly?
Well, shall I go first?
Yes, go for it.
Forgive me. It will probably make it more difficult for small European exporters to do what they wish to do, because they find it more difficult to bear the burden of it. But I think the interesting question politically is what the future Labour government does in terms of its relationship with the big single market that we have on our doorstep. Because it's very difficult to create the kind of access that I think Labour wish to have with the constraints that will be imposed as a consequence.
Right. Well, on that, just briefly, the case for progressive realism in foreign affairs. This is David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. Why Britain must chart a new global course. Is that a new global course back into the single market?
We're not going to be joining the single market. We've already said that very clearly.
But do everything
and we're not going to be rejoining the European Union. I don't want to have another referendum in my life if I could possibly avoid it, because I think it divides people into two camps, and it makes for bad politics. It also tends to be the practice of tyrants and demagogues, as Mrs Thatcher once said.
All right.
But we do need to be rational about our relationship with Europe. So we need to make sure, for instance, that British acts can go and tour around Europe without impediment. We need to make sure that businesses aren't facing two different sets of regulations for completely unnecessary reasons. We want regulatory convergence rather than divergence.
We've only got a few seconds. Do you hope, or are you watching Labour with interest in the way Matthew is in terms of plotting that course back?
I mean, I hope that whatever does happen, it is not... For me, what's really struck me is the referendum happened in 2016. We've known this was coming. Why are we still in this shambolic state?
And on those words, shambolic state.
The industry is saying this has been delayed 5 times. We have no deal.
That's it. That's all we have time for from all of us here. Sorry, Dahlia. Bye.
Hello, parents.